So, welcome to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series of podcasts which tries to get insight through some incisive dialogue with some of the world's leading independent thinkers on matters related to digital technology. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO at Access Partnership, and my guest today is Matt Hatton. Matt is an industry analyst with over 25 years of experience, most of which has been focused on IoT. He's currently the founding partner at Transformer Insights, which is one of the world's leading IoT analyst firms. And previously to that, he was founder and CEO of Machina Research, which was acquired by Gartner in 2016. And along with me, he's the author of a book, the Internet of Things Myth, that Matt and I published together a few years ago, which tried to explore why some of the forecasts that were made for the industry back in 2010 ended up being so far out of alignment with what we actually got in the real world. And so that's how I'm going to kick us off, Matt. So we've been through the classic Gartner hype curve and more with IoT. We've had this big spike of interest in sort of around 2010, 2011. It all went a bit flat after that. Arguably a bit more of a spike when 5G was first talked about and introduced, and then perhaps a bit of a drop again off of that. Do you think we're out of all that now? Have we actually got to a point where we do know really what's happening? We don't need to hype it anymore. It's kind of out there. It's kind of doing its thing. And if so, what is that thing?
I think you've left me with a dozen or so things to unpack in there. That way. But first off, delighted to be considered one of the world's great independent thinkers. Was it something along those lines? Anyway, that's
it was absolutely.
That's great. IoT. Okay, first thing to know, back in 2010, we saw all these forecasts of 50 billion connected devices by 2020. I was doing forecasting of the Internet of Things back in 2011. Actually, we started doing it, and actually we didn't think it was going to be anything like 50 billion devices. We were predicting something like 12. That was our first stake in the ground, 12 billion by 2020, and we weren't that far off, actually. It was sort of in 10-ish, and we had the first year of COVID in there, which disrupted things rather. So I don't think we were, as analysts at Machina Research, I don't think we were actually too far off. But there's a lot of interesting dynamics that's happened in the space since then. There was that initial great flurry of interest in machine-to-machine space in the 2011, 12, 13 kind of time. You got some IoT unicorns cropping up, Jasper being sold to Cisco in, I think, 2014, if I remember rightly, something like that. And we had...
That's about right. And that was targeted at automotive, wasn't it, mostly?
Well, broadly across all of cellular-based connectivity as a connectivity management platform. And actually, that was around about the time when a lot of the telecoms operators saw IoT as being, the great hope for where they're going to drive additional connections. And so Jasper popped up at just about the right time, saying, "Hey, we can take all your troubles away. We can be your entry point into the Internet of Things. Will effectively be a substitute for developing your own platform, and indeed, in many cases, developing your own strategy." We saw that quite a lot with companies thinking, well, if I take this platform, that's going to effectively give me an IoT approach. And actually, it was rather more complicated than that. So that was something of an oversimplification, but they did very well on the back of it. And we had, there are a few others. ThingWorks was another good example, picked up by PTC, and there was quite a few others, and that was similar sorts of time frames. And then I feel that actually things maybe went a little bit slow round about the 15, 16, 17 kind of time frame. Actually, we had what I termed the first IoT winter. AI has had, I don't know, 3 or 4 winters where it takes a while for the technology leap that's happened to actually bed in, and it felt like at that point we had a similar sort of thing happening in IoT, where there were a lot of new and interesting technologies that were coming through, particularly access technology. Actually, you had your Sigfox, your LoRaWANs, and some of the things that you refer to under 5G, but actually really mean, NB-IoT and LTN. Well, NB-IoT, you know very well, being based on Newell's technology. Exactly. And LTEM, they were just sort of starting to bubble up as well, and we kind of went through a bit of a slow period then, and then we kind of got through that a little bit, and it turned out that actually we've got this great set of technologies that are actually optimized for IoT. So around about 2020, we published a report on what we termed the thin IoT stack, which was looking at all of these various different technologies across all of the different elements of the stack, the devices. So things like the operating systems. You had a bunch of operating systems much more appropriate for constrained environments. You had a set of communications protocols that were much more appropriate for IoT, things like CoAP and MQTT and lightweight M2M. And then you had these access technologies like Sigfox and LoRaWAN and NB-IoT, and so again, much more appropriate for IoT. So all the way through this stack, you had a set of capabilities which actually were right for IoT. And the ironic thing was that around about that time, I think some of the luster might have come off the IoT, and actually in the last maybe 12 months or so, it seems like there's been a little bit of cynicism in the space. I've been at a few events where there's quite a lot of woe is me, the Internet of Things is maybe not doing as well as we'd all hoped. I think at least partly because we've seen some quite significant exits from the space, particularly the big companies. So IBM with what's an IoT and Google IoT Core, and Ericsson selling out its IoT connectivity management platform, one that competed with Jasper. There was this sort of idea of some of these players moving out of the space, and is that a bit of a vote of no confidence? And I was at one event where there was a panel session, and people talking about, okay, there's some challenges in the space. Maybe it's not super great place to be at the moment. But then at the same time, they were all talking about, and we've connected 5 million of these, or we've sold 500,000 of these kind of things. And I, as the analyst, am supposed to be the cynical one, and I had to point out, you're talking the space down, but actually, effectively, you're all doing amazing business, solving real world problems, and shipping hundreds of thousands of devices, supporting millions of connections, depending on who they are. So actually, I think there's still ample reason to be positive. But I kind of see that shift out of the those bigger players, the ones who aren't IoT specialists, as being a bit of a reflection of the fact that they sort of thought this would be a market of infinitely scalable, universally applicable IoT platforms. And actually, that's not what the space is about. The space is about hundreds and hundreds of different applications, all of which have rather different needs, all of which have been sort of lumped under this umbrella of IoT. And actually, what they need is somebody to walk them through how you deploy the solution, help them optimize all the various different elements. It's all that not particularly sexy stuff, but things that have to be done, and also not massively scalable. And so that's the reason, I think, why some of those bigger players saw it as being not perhaps the space that they wanted to be in. Although even that's unfair, right? Is IBM still in IoT? Of course it is. They're an enormous consulting business. They do a lot of stuff in edge compute. They've got tremendous involvement in IoT, just not as this single universal IoT platform. So,
and I think sort of one of the in a way to summarize our book, it was almost it's actually not just a case of comms providers throwing out connectivity and saying, job done, everyone just please turn on your IoT systems. It's much more about system integrators needing to get in there and implement everything that's needed, including the change management within the company and the IT systems in the company and the connectivity and all these other kind of things. And it feels like from what you're saying, in a way, that realization is now coming about with the Ericssons and others. And the mobile operators, do you think as well? Do you sort of see them backing out a bit out of IoT provision?
I do a bit, but to take a step back, a lot of it's to do with the complexity, because you maybe have had developers who've worked in devices or developers who worked in cloud, and actually you've got to span both of those. You've got to span connectivity. You've got to become an expert in multiple disciplines in order to deploy all of this stuff. And typically the enterprises that are deploying it have got no heritage, no expertise in that. It means a transformation in in a lot of their processes that they might have operated. Because a good example, there's a company called Anti-Simex. They do connected rat traps, essentially pest control. Should we say that?
Yeah.
More appropriate way of describing it. And they used to send people around to check on these traps on a regular basis. And they realized that actually it'd be much better for our enterprise resource planning if we connected all of these things, and then we only send people off to empty the traps that have been triggered. And off the back of that, they then had to completely rework how the organization worked. But it meant that they were tremendously more competitive than every other company doing the same sort of stuff, which meant they then massively expanded into all sorts of other geographies that they previously had not been involved in. So it's a big success story. But back to your question, on the carrier side of things, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. We have seen some of the carriers reconsidering what their approach might be to IoT, and doing that in a number of different ways. One of the big things that we do at Transform Insights every year, and we did this in the previous company, Makina Research, as well, so it's something we've been doing for a decade or more. We do a benchmarking report of communication service providers, looking at their capabilities and strategies and approaches and so on. So we do a real deep dive on all these various players, and there is amongst some of the players a view that actually, this is maybe a market that's more appropriately addressed by some specialist players, MVNO, in fact, who are a little bit more agile, focused specifically on the IoT space, but actually maybe it's more of a bifurcation. So you've got effectively two markets within IoT. One is about cellular-based IoT.
Yeah.
So you've got one which is about low-cost sensors, maybe battery-powered, relying on some of these LPWA technologies. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the connected cars and CCTV cameras and that sort of high end. Yeah. Now, is there a good opportunity for the carriers in that high end stuff? Yeah. Towards the lower end, well, typically they haven't really got the processes and the systems and platforms and so on to address those, and so we're seeing maybe a bit of a pullback from that lower tier end of the spectrum, or indeed a tiering. So one of the more famous new arrivals in the IoT connectivity space was Once, who launched in, I think, about 2016, 2017, sort of. As their headline was 10 euros for 10 years connectivity. That very famous offer. Now, most carriers can't afford to support connections at that lower revenue per user. Actually, funnily enough, it's not really 10 euros for 10 years connectivity. It's 10 euros for 500 megabytes, which is 20 euros for a gig. Well, that's not bad business, actually. But the thing is, you've got to support it over a long period, and you're paying for your software platform on a monthly basis. And so, well, does that quite work with the economics of supporting them? So you look at someone like Deutsche Telekom, which owns 40% of. It's about 40%. It's a little bit unclear, but it's something of that order. And more or less, they use Once. They own 40% of Once, and they use Once kind of as their low cost, low touch, prepaid online channel kind of onboarding approach, and they focus more on the higher value end of the spectrum. So there's some interesting stuff.
And what about satellite? I mean, it's long been mooted for IoT, sometimes for backhaul, but we seem to be now seeing a number of companies, Satellios and others. I think EchoStar have put up a concept of launching. Some are using LoRaWAN, others using NB-IoT from a satellite. Is that going to go anywhere? I mean, you can kind of see that if you truly want global roaming and you want to be able to connect your device from a ship in the Atlantic, then it's the only way. But is that a sizable market, do you think?
Very crowded space at the moment. Yes, there's a lot of companies deploying constellations of LEOs or claiming to be deploying constellations of LEOs or sort of aiming to deploy, shall we say. And then you dig into it, you say, okay, well, how many satellites have you got? And they say, oh, well, we've got one, and then we're deploying another 2 in the course of the next 12 months. And then suddenly it looks a little less impressive. And we did a little tot up of this last year, and there's about 40-ish companies that are deploying these. And I suspect there's probably a market for about 3 or 4. So we're likely to see quite a lot of consolidation. For sure. And that's in the context of, well, these things actually don't last that long in orbit. You compare it to the geostationary satellites, where when they were put up in over the last 50, 60 years, whatever it was, that they would last for decades. But actually, these LEOs not so much. So the question is, can they maintain a constellation of satellites and get enough revenue in to be launching new ones to replace the ones that go out of service? And we've got a little bit of skepticism, but that notwithstanding, yes, tremendously useful in some use cases, but really it's quite a limited range of use cases. So the generous way we describe it as is that it will outperform the market over the course of the next 10 years. So one of the things we do is super granular forecast, looking at all the technologies and all that kind of stuff. And overall IoT going from 13 billion to 34 billion over the course of the next 10 years. So pretty steady growth, actually. It's no hockey sticks. It's it's steady growth over the next 10 years. And of that, satellite, we think, was about 0.05% as of end of last year. And we think that goes to about 0.2%.
Okay.
So in terms of growing share of the market, tremendous impact, actually. But in terms of overall impact on IoT, rather more limited. But we'll reserve judgment on that a little bit. There was interesting. This isn't supposed to be an advert for Deutsche Telekom, by the way, but there was interesting conversation with them in Barcelona at Mobile World Congress, and they launched a complementary service for NB-IoT. I think it was with Satelliot, if I remember. And the idea there is what they're providing it for is a backup. So we sell you NB-IoT. If you haven't got access to a network wherever the device is deployed, you have this backup of satellite connectivity. So what proportion of those devices are actually going to be connected to the satellite? Very small proportion. Is it tremendously beneficial to know that wherever you put these devices, assuming they're not stuck in a basement somewhere or whatever, wherever you put it, it will be guaranteed some form of connectivity? Yes, that's tremendously useful. So almost as an insurance policy for connecting devices, I think maybe that's the
market potentially
for that. It could well be.
And we sort of touched on 5G earlier, but is that myth finally done, or at least the massive machine connectivity element of 5G that is touted as 1 million devices per square kilometer, and 5G was going to going to revolutionize IoT. As you said, of course, all it did was subsume the 4G IoT technologies. I don't think it's changed them materially. There is a reduced capability variant coming along, I think, but that looks like it's not really going to hit a large number of devices.
Yes, agree on both counts. So if we go technical, 5G is going to dominate the numbers of cellular connected devices over the course of the next 10 years. But that includes the vast majority of that is these NB-IoT and LTE-M devices, which technically have been dragged kicking and screaming into the 5G standard as 5G MMTC, but we all know they're not really 5G networks, except for the fact that they will continue to be supported, those technologies, on 5G core. So you can have some certainty that technology is going to be around. I thought I'd be long retired before we started talking about 4G switch off, but people do start talking now about 4G switch off. But even should 4G switch off happen, these devices would still be connected on via 5G networks. So there's some benefit of that sort of longevity. But in terms of pure 5G, the sort of full fat 5G, connected cars, some uses for applications that need a lot of video streaming, CCTV, and so on. But majority is connected cars, because the car manufacturers like to be, well, firstly, they like to be future-proof. So they will almost invariably opt for whatever the latest, greatest technology is, because they know they're going to be in those vehicles for years or whatever.
Yeah.
So they'll tend to favor that. So in a way, 5G is driving the market, but it's really in terms of these low power technologies, which aren't really part of 5G. But you also mentioned 5G RedCap.
Yeah.
The reduced capability, which is actually a native 5G application, if I can describe it that way. Not quite accurate, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that rather falls between two stools. I mean, in fact, we set this up quite neatly. I mentioned about that sort of bifurcation between the high-end, high-bandwidth applications, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the sort of sensor devices that need to be really cheap, run on a battery for 10 years, and so on. And RedCap kind of falls between those.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide the high-end, high bandwidth that you get with 5G, or even with Cat 4 LTE. Actually, kind of comparable with Cat 4, but at a significantly higher price point. Now, RedCap cheaper than 5G new radio, but not that much cheaper, and certainly nowhere near the battery life that you get with NB-IoT and LTE-M, and certainly nowhere near the sort of price points. I think RedCap's maybe $50.
Kind of like the fairness bodies sort of felt they had to come up with something to merit 5G having IoT, and they saw a gap between two different technologies and said, "Oh, we'll put something into that gap," rather than asking, "Do we need something in that gap?"
I have seen some commentators saying, "Oh, it hits a sweet spot between the capabilities of these other technologies." And actually, if you look at the market and how people are using it and what applications they're using it for, there isn't much in that mid ground. There's a few things, some consumer electronics devices, smartwatches. I think that probably that's a good use case for RedCap. Also, we're probably being a little bit unfair on RedCap, because it will evolve with the subsequent releases, the subsequent 3GPP releases. There will be gradual evolutions in that, and improvements, reduction in capability, and therefore in cost and complexity and so on. So it will get better, and the evolution path in terms of low power wide area within 5G is very much going to be RedCap, but not this latest release. It's going to be a few down the line.
And for a long time, one of my gripes about IoT was there were too many wireless standards. I mean, there's plenty of other problems, but one of the issues was it wasn't obvious if you wanted to implement something in IoT, which at the time, back in sort of the 2012, 2013, the myriad different wireless standards you could choose from. You mentioned some of them. There was Sigfox, LoRa, Weightless, Zigbee, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G coming up. Do you think we've settled down a bit now? It feels like sort of LoRa and NB-IoT in those sort of for those two types of applications are kind of settling out a bit, but then maybe not. I don't know.
I every time I think it's settling down, a bunch of new technologies crop up.
Yeah.
That's typically how I see this thing. And that's good because it kind of keeps us on our toes. There's this new set of kind of intermediate, not quite wide area network technologies, things like DEC 2020 NR Plus, as it's been positioned, Wi-Sun, Wi-Fi Halo. There's a bunch of these which are coming up, which are ranges of 1, 2, 3 kilometers. Actually, that's not entirely accurate for some, because then based on mesh networks, it doesn't quite work like that. So there's kind of a middle tier between the short range and the wide area technologies. So it's still a constantly evolving space, and you've got to bear in mind, of course, that IoT is not a single homogeneous thing. My point about some of these big players semi-exiting the IoT space because it's not this homogeneous thing that they can address with one single all-encompassing platform. Well, the same thing applies on the technologies. You can't address every use case with a single all-encompassing technology, much as scale would benefit from being able to do that. But in reality, the requirements of every one of the hundreds and hundreds of different IoT applications is very different, and so you have to be thinking about, or they're inevitably going to gravitate towards different technologies, and there isn't going to be a single technology to rule them all.
So I was just sort of reflecting as we were talking. You mentioned things like the connected car and so on. I was thinking, actually, if I look back to where I was as an individual 10 years ago, I've now got connected cars, not because I connected them; they just came connected. I've actually slowly got a bit more connected bits in my house. We've got like a Ring doorbell and things like that for various other reasons. And so actually, these things kind of creep up on you almost, rather than it being a big bang. And every now and again, you sort of step back and say, actually, a lot more is connected now than it was 10 years ago. But because it hasn't happened in the same way that you suddenly got your first iPhone or whatever, it wasn't quite such an obvious moment. Do you think that's where we're going for the next 4 or 5 years, sort of just steady, creeping incrementalism, which is no bad thing at all, just not particularly exciting?
No, and I think, well, in terms of the growth trajectory, yes, it's steady growth. That's what we're looking at. It's a 10% CAGR over the next 10 years. And honestly, I think that's all right.
Yeah.
There are plenty of ICT sectors that have been boom and bust. I was, working in the mobile space back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was, there was tremendous growth, and then things kind of tailed off, and it all went a bit strange because everybody was expecting this 50% growth every year, and you can only sustain that for a couple of years before the market dries out. But actually having a space which is a series of overlapping applications and use cases that grow at different rates, and you sum them all up, and you've got this relatively stable growth. I think that's pretty solid. And I think of a few use cases. We just got solar panels fitted on the roof. That's it. I never really thought about the fact that there is a SIM card in there somewhere. It's connecting using someone. It's completely opaque to me. I know that I'm updated on a regular basis to my smartphone app that how much electricity we're generating and what have you, but there's been no involvement from my side. doing that. So it's connected somehow. And another interesting category is white goods. We see tremendous. Yeah, well, the famous connected fridge. Yeah, exactly. This is the one that's always been touted. This idea that it'll be able to tell you how much milk you've got left and blah blah. Actually, it was actually really never going to be about that. Now, the fridge manufacturers would have loved it to be about that, because then they could have charged a premium for providing a premium product. But actually, nobody wanted it. What it's actually for is management of warranty and really mundane stuff like keeping an eye on how your devices are performing out in the field. And actually what you needed was the price of connectivity, the things like battery life, all of the various functionality to start getting to be more appropriate for IoT, that thin IoT stack talking about. I mean, I was talking about technology there, but actually price comes into it. You start getting scale economies from the for the various components and for the connectivity. The connectivity costs have come down dramatically in the last 10 years. We would typically have talked about, I don't know, $10 a month for connecting an IoT device, and now people routinely talk about 20 cents, 50 cents a year. It seems nuts, but that kind of dynamic opens up a lot of opportunities for say a white goods manufacturer, and so you're not really thinking about it. You're not really buying it deliberately because it's got some form of connectivity in there, but it's got it.
It's got it, and I think you made a really good point. 10% growth a year or whatever it is actually pretty good. It's just that we've got this expectation somehow of explosive growth. But actually, if we stand back and look at the mobile operators, they've generally got no growth. So IoT growing is doing a lot better than they are. And in fact, for many industries in the world, 10% growth a year would be fabulous. So actually, it's in no way you should be seen as a disappointment. It's just we need to kind of rethink our sort of reference points on this and see it just for what it is, which is a good, solid service that's becoming ever more pervasive, growing by the billions over 10-year periods, and really doing some good stuff.
Yeah, and don't forget, it probably grew 5-fold over the last 10 years, maybe 10-fold. I forget the specifics of the numbers, but it's something of that order. So there might be a little less hype around at the moment, but there's certainly a lot more revenue being generated because the scale of the space is that much bigger. And this is recurring revenue type models. Well, not all of it is. The hardware piece obviously isn't, but often it's recurring revenue models. So it's a bigger space now than it was back in, well, say 10 years ago, but perhaps not with the excitement about this being the bright, shiny new thing. That's all ChatGPT now. That's a new.
Yeah,
I suspect that's a conversation for a different day.
Yes, and we both promise this is not generated by ChatGPT, but the real people. Matt, on that note, I think that's all we have time for. But thank you ever so much. Lovely to catch up with you again. Great chat, and I'll look out for my next connected device, which probably won't be too long from now.